looking at the book of Colossians, and we're talking through all the things that happen there. And we're dealing with a group of people that are very similar to us as far as our relationship with Jesus and the apostles and the New Testament goes, because the church at Colossae was not started by an apostle. They were started by a guy who heard the apostle preach, and he came and he taught them. And the thing about not having an apostle there and not having the New Testament to look at is they're just kind of lost about what they need to believe and what they need to think and how they need to act. They're lost. And so what they do is they send their pastor to go find Paul and to get some instructions. And say, we're just completely lost. And so Paul writes back the letter to the Colossians, and he writes the letter to Philemon, who is a guy in the church there. He writes those two letters and sends them back with another guy, because while their pastor is there, he's put in jail and can't come back himself. And Paul is talking to them, trying to help them understand what they need to believe. And instead of attacking everything that they believe that's wrong, what he does is say, look, we're all over the place because you're not starting in the right place. You don't get who Jesus is. And if you don't start with who Jesus is, you're not going to land with what you need to believe and what you need to do. That's not how this works. If you don't start in the right place, you don't end in the right place. And so he prays for them first in the first part, those first few verses, and then he goes on and he describes who Jesus is. Now, he describes what Jesus did and who Jesus is. And last week we just looked at like 3 verses and talked about the work of Jesus and what he did. But now we're going to look at Jesus' resume, and that's really how Paul lays it out, is Jesus' resume, what qualifies him to be there. Because their struggle is with Jesus. They recognize the idea of a creator, and they recognize that Jesus died and came back from the dead, but they are unsure about where Jesus ranks, because they've got all this pagan background. They've got pagan background with all these gods that were there, and they were trying to be like, well, I really still think those things are real, but where do they rank in this? Is Jesus one of them? How does that work? They've got the Jewish people that are part of the church, and they've got some worship of angels and things that are wrapped up in there, and they're trying to figure out, where does Jesus rank in all of those things? Where does Jesus rank in all of those things? Who is he? And the way that Paul deals with this is by giving them the resume. He says, this is who Jesus is. So we're going to look, starting in Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15, we're going to go through and just read Jesus' resume that Paul gives to the church. And I'm just going to tell you, going through this week was impactful. This week was impactful for me, and I hope it'll be impactful for you as well. So he starts off, and let's just read through everything that we're going to talk about today. He starts off in verse 15. He, that's Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. That's what we're going to get through today and talk about today, is Jesus' resume. He starts off and says that he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. They're trying to figure out who Jesus is and where he ranks, right? Because in their mind, especially coming from a background of Greek and Roman mythology, do you realize, I don't know if you've studied this very much, in Greek and Roman mythology, they don't really have an idea of who the creator is. They don't have an idea of who the supreme God is. We're like, well, that's Zeus. No, he was the one that was in charge at that time. But Zeus's dad was in charge before then. Before Zeus, I think he chopped him up and threw him into hell or something. I don't remember exactly what happened there. But this story, they keep going back, and every time they go back, there's somebody else's dad. There's somebody else. They don't have an idea of who the creator is, but they recognize that there is one. In Greek philosophy, the idea of the creator is this word logos. It's where we get the word logic. It's the idea of this force that orders everything. And so they don't have a problem with there being a creator and somebody else. They just can't figure out where to put Jesus. They also have this issue where they are really struggling with not having anything to look at or touch. Right? If you were raised in Catholicism, you're used to the rosary. You got something to touch when you pray. You got something to look at. You got something to touch. You got all these statues up on the wall that you can focus your attention on. And it was the same thing for them. Laodicea, which is just right up the road from Colossae where they're at, was the home of worship of, it was either Julius or Augustus Caesar, I don't remember which at this moment, but that was their home. And so they had all these statues. And from a culture that's used to having something to look at, something to touch, to direct your worship towards, direct your prayers towards, it was really difficult for them. And so Paul says, here's what I want you to understand. You've got these two ideas of the Creator and these other things, and you're trying to figure out where Jesus ranks in that. John talks about this, and when he talks about Jesus, he describes Jesus as the Logos, the Word. In the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. That's the Greek idea of a creator. And he's saying, like, what you think is that Jesus is one of these demigods somewhere, but he is one with the Father. He said, you've got these statues that you want to worship. But God commanded the people of Israel not to make statues. In Exodus 20, verse 4, he said, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth below, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. He said, I don't want you to make a statue of me. I don't want you to make an image of me. I don't want you to make a statue of an image or anything that you might come later to worship as me. Because I cannot be contained in a statue. It is an insult to me to try to say, this is a picture of God, because you can't capture who I am in a piece of rock or in a piece of stone or in daubs of paint. You can't do that. I am more than that. But what Paul says is, though God commanded that we make no image of him, he made an image of himself. And that is Jesus. That the human body of Jesus is the image of God that is to be worshiped. But the difference is that he was not a piece of stone, he was not a piece of wood, he was not paint, but rather he was the human image of God. And later on in those verses we just read, it says that all the fullness of God, that is the Creator God, dwelled within the image of God. So the image that the picture that Paul is painting here, picture that Paul is painting is unintentional. The picture that Paul is painting, he's like, you want something to grasp onto, you want something to hold on to worship the Creator. But what I want you to understand is Jesus is that image. But he is better than all your idols. He is better than all your statues of Julius Caesar that you've got up in this town that you worship. Because those may look like him, but they're dead things. Jesus was filled with the presence of God. He was God, and not just a limitation of God, but all of God dwelt within him. You're trying to figure out where to rank him. You've got the Creator God, which y'all don't mess with too much because nobody knows who that is, but then you got all these other things. What I'm telling you is we know who that is, and he is one with the one that came to be with us. He is the image of the invisible God, the thing that he's trying to connote to them, the thing that he's trying to bring up in their minds is the fact that they don't need an idol to worship, they don't need a statue to worship, they worship Jesus. The way that they would look at that statue of Zeus or of Caesar, whoever it was that they would look at and they would worship it, you want to direct your worship to the Father, you look at Jesus and worship him. Because he is the express image of God, and filled with all that God is. The only limitations placed on Jesus were the ones he placed on himself. And he is the one that's to be worshiped. He is the firstborn of all creation. And this is the confusing one because of the way that we say firstborn, right? Because okay, if Jesus was the Creator, he is God, but he wasn't made, how is he the firstborn? Wasn't he the first one that was made of all the things that were made? Well, that's a very obvious literal reading of that, the firstborn of all creation. And you know that I'm a literal guy. I want to go with a literal reading. But there are several times throughout the Old Testament that firstborn is used to talk about somebody who is not the first one to exit the womb, okay? In Jeremiah, I think it's Jeremiah 31. Let's just go ahead and pull that. In Jeremiah 31, it says this, and this is not apropos to anything we're talking about except for the use of the word firstborn. With weeping they shall come, and with pleas for mercy I will lead them back. I will make them walk by brooks of water in a straight path in which they shall not stumble, for I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Now, what you might read if you don't know anything about Genesis and how all that stuff worked out, you might look at that and say, okay, Ephraim is the oldest. Except that Ephraim was not the oldest of Israel's children. He was not the oldest of the ones that were made into tribes of Israel. He was actually one of the youngest. So why does God refer to him as the firstborn, even though out of all the 12 tribes of Israel, he is one of the most recent? Why is he the firstborn? Well, see, when the firstborn is there, that firstborn is not just a, hey, you exited the womb first, but it's a title. It means that you're going to be the primary heir. It means that you're the one that will receive the largest share of the inheritance. You're the one that will receive the Father's authority and power and everything that there is to the Father. You would refer to the crown prince as the firstborn, regardless of whether he was the first to exit the womb or not, because he is firstborn in rank, not in birth. Throughout the Old Testament, the firstborn does refer to the first to exit the womb, the first to be born. But when God is talking about, when he's talking to them about the nations of Israel, he says, Ephraim is my firstborn, regardless of the fact that he was nowhere close to the firstborn. But he is firstborn because he is first in rank. At this time, Ephraim was the leader out of the tribes of Israel. It was the most important of the tribes, and it was the firstborn. It had the rank of the firstborn. In Psalm chapter 89, there's references to the Messiah. We're talking about Jesus. And it says in Psalm chapter 89, verse 27, I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. How do you make someone the firstborn? Well, I'm just going to decide that you will have in the past been the first to have been born. You can't make someone have been born first. But what you can do is you can make them the first in rank. You can make them the primary heir. You can give them the rights of the firstborn. So when Paul talks about Jesus, he says that he is the image of God, but also that he is the firstborn. That doesn't mean that he was the first to be created, but it's describing his place in authority over all creation. He is the one who is over all things. All of the authority of the Creator belongs to him. And you want to know where to put Jesus in relationship to the Father? You put them right next to each other. Because he is the first in rank over all creation. Verse 16, for by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. If you remember back in Genesis, we get the creation story, right? We got the creation story, we got the 7 days of creation, and God spoke and it was. And that's how creation is described to us. But there's not all the detail about what happened there. There's a whole day, and everything that's covered in that day was God spoke and it was. That's the whole day. That's 24 hours. But what John tells us in John chapter 1, which I just referenced, and what Paul tells us is there's other things going on in creation. And what was going on was that the Father spoke and the Son executed the will of the Father. When John talks about the ordering force that created all things, he doesn't talk about the Father, he talks about the Son. Because though the Father spoke and it was done, it was Jesus that did the doing. We built this building over here, right? We added on this addition. We got three big classrooms. We've got a big multi-purpose space. We've got 2 nurseries. We've got a bunch of bathrooms. We built that on. Raise your hand if you swung a hammer or installed any insulation in that building. Clayton's not here. I thought I would have one. Clayton's not here today. I did take his parents home. How did we build that building if we didn't swing a hammer? We built that building because we decided it was going to be built. We funded the money for it to be built. We designed it. We laid out the plans. We hired the people. We built it. We built it through Okie Construction, which we regret. But we built it through them, but we built it. And when the Father spoke, the Son acted. What Paul tells us is that Jesus was the one through whom all things were created. You want to know where Jesus ranks? He is the one that made all things. Everything that you're wondering, where does Jesus rank when it comes to the angels? Where does Jesus rank when it comes to these other spiritual beings? Where does Jesus rank? He is the firstborn over all creation. He is the one that made all things. John talks about it like this. In the beginning was the Word. This is John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. That's the Logos. In the beginning, the very beginning, was this Greek idea of the Creator. That was Jesus. And He was with God, and He was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Jesus, you want to know His resume? He is the image of God, completely filled with everything that is God, the first in rank over all things in creation, not all created things, all things in creation, and the one through whom all things in creation were made. All things in heaven and on earth. We talked a little bit the last couple of weeks ago about Gnosticism, how they're dealing with this idea of Gnosticism. And this big idea of Gnosticism is that all physical things are evil. And so God must not have been the one to make physical things, so God made all these other little demigods, and one of them made all physical things, and He's separate from that. But what Paul says is no. All things that were made by Jesus. Physical things, spiritual things. All thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, that is both physical, literal, on the earth governments, exist because Jesus allows them or decided that they would exist. All spiritual realms, anything that happens in the spirit, and Paul doesn't attack any of that. His goal is not to attack any of that right now. But he says, whatever you're thinking of, whatever you're imagining that might exist, none of it could have been made were it not for Jesus, and none of it exists without Him sustaining it. He is over all things. Verse 17, He is before all things. That Jesus came before all things, and this word, the word that's translated before from the Greek, doesn't just mean comes first, but it's first in rank, first in time, first in preeminence, that He is above and before all things. He outranks everything that can have existed. He outranks every politician that you love and hate. He outranks every emperor that has ever existed. He outranks every problem that you have faced. He is before not all people. He is before not all beings. He is before all things. And in Him, all things hold together. This idea that He spun the top and then stepped away is not what Paul is getting out here. That He set things in motion and steps away. But rather, the only reason that it continues to exist is because He holds it together. Where does Jesus rank? Jesus is the one that made it. Jesus is the one that allows it to continue. Jesus is the one that holds it together. There is no problem you face. There is no person you face. There is no situation that you face that is not held together and allowed by Him. And I want you to just kind of focus on that, because when Paul talks about this and he talks about Jesus, he really doesn't talk about Him being a carpenter. He doesn't talk about Him being a teacher. He doesn't talk about His miracles. He doesn't talk about His earthly ministry. He says, you want to know what's important to know about Jesus when you're trying to figure out where He goes? He is first in all things. It doesn't matter what idea you come up with, He is above it. Because you would not exist to have come up with it were it not for Him. You would not be held together were it not for Him. He is above all things. So he talks about Jesus that way, and then he says this, and I just kind of want you to focus on this. Where we're at, we're like cosmic being, holding all things together, creator of the universe, holding all things. Just keep that image of Jesus in your mind. And then go to verse 18. He is the head of the body, the church. Now, we're used to that kind of language, right? Jesus, head of the church. Of course He is. That's not a big deal, Ben. For these guys, I want you to think about this. Where is Jesus? Spinning Jupiter on His finger. sustaining of all of creation, holding all things together, and head of the church. Those are two very different things on the scale. Two very different things on the scale. It's like saying Elon Musk, most richest man in the world, and head of your local elementary school PTA. Like if you go to the PTA and like, Elon Musk, why are you here? Why? I'm in charge. I run this PTA. Like, you're the richest man in the world. You have all these people working for you. You can do anything. Why are you the head of this organization too? Because I want to be. Because my kids are in this. Because I care about this. Paul wants to give you this giant image of Jesus that is too big to fit in this room. And say, and what he has chosen to spend his time on is the church. Do you get the scale of these two things? Am I expressing this enough? I'm afraid I can't express this well enough to understand how shocking it is that Paul would transition from the Logos, the creator and sustainer of all things, the ordering effect in the universe, the one that carried out the orders when the Father gave the orders to make all things, and the one that is your leader. Jesus could have outsourced this. He could have used a lackey to head this. But instead, he said, that is too important for me to hand that off to somebody else. I'm going to do this myself. You want to know where Jesus ranks? And I want you to think about this. Like, we think of ourselves, we wouldn't say this, but we think of ourselves like we're the good people, right? We're the ones at church. We're the ones that show up on Sunday morning. We're the ones that get dressed up. We're the ones that's us. We're the good. Of course, he would be a part of us. But don't look at it that way. Here's what I want you to look at this as. I want you to look at us as the convicted felons on death row who got a pardon and have now formed an organization where they all get together. And the thing that they have in common is not that their crimes are equal, not that their crimes are the same, but they have all deserved their punishment and have been pardoned. And you know what I would do with a group like that? Like if I was in charge of pardoning people and I'm like, these people have done it, I'm going to show mercy, I'm going to pardon them. You know what I would do next? I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time with them. Because these are traitors, these are rebels who thought we can rebel against the one who's spinning Jupiter. We can rebel against him and go do our thing. We can set ourselves up as God. And when we fell on our faces and recognized that we couldn't, his response was not, well, y'all go, I'm going to pardon you because I'm a great guy, but y'all go sit in that corner and leave me alone. His response was, I'm going to bring you into the house and I'm going to adopt you and I'm going to turn you into a family and I'm going to be the head of that family and I'm going to use that family to change the world. He is the head of the body, the church. When Paul lays out the importance of things, the things that Jesus spends his time on, he puts creating the universe and the daily direction of the church on equal scale of importance to Jesus. He puts them on the same playing field. And I'm going to talk about this again in just a minute, but I just want you to think about this. When you rank how important the church is, do you and Jesus agree? Do you and Jesus agree? He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning. He is the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Here's the juxtaposition of these two things, okay? Paul says, in order that he might be preeminent first over everything in all things. He was the creator. He was the first. But he said, you know what? When it comes to the resurrection of the dead, I will be first in that too. He said, I'm not going to say, y'all need to take care of this, get this done, I'm going to do it. But he came himself. He died. He lived a life that we could not live. He lived a sinless life, and then he died, all for the purpose of establishing his preeminence in all things, because he would not outsource this work. He would not leave this to someone else, but he did this that he might be preeminent. And he is the firstborn of the dead, so that we, rebels, traitors, who do not deserve a second consideration, so that we would be confident in our own resurrection, because if he was resurrected and he promised to resurrect us, then we will be resurrected too. We, who deserve nothing from him, he has chosen to be the head, and he has chosen to be the first of us to be resurrected, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him, this is verse 19, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And when you look at this, you've got to really think about this from the mindset of somebody who is trying to figure out who Jesus is. They understand the Creator, they get the Creator, and Paul wants you to understand that the Creator was so happy with all of this that it was not a burden for God, the Creator, to be Jesus. In fact, it was something that gave him pleasure to do. And you want to know how Jesus ranks in all of this? You get the Creator, but you don't get Jesus. The Creator is Jesus and was pleased to be so. And through him, to reconcile to himself all things. You have been separated from God. I have been separated from God by our sin. He told Adam and Eve in the garden, he said, I'm going to give you a test. If you eat from this tree, then you're rejecting me as God. And if you don't eat from this tree, then you're accepting me as God. This is the act of worship I want. You don't have to write any songs. You don't have to learn how to play the guitar. You don't have to learn any other languages. Here's the act of worship I want. Acknowledge me as God by staying away from this tree. And I will give you the whole world to enjoy. And that was not enough for us. And we separated ourselves from God, because when our ancestor, our forebear, took that apple, it wasn't an apple. They don't grow in the Middle East. When they took that piece of fruit, I'm actually not sure about where they grow. But anyway, when they took that piece of fruit, they were saying, we want to be God. And you and I have made that same decision over and over and over. I will consider your advice, God. I will take it under consideration. I will look to see what you have to say, but I am the decider. I decide. I'm God. You are not. And we have been separated from God because of that ever since. But what Jesus came to do was to reconcile, to bring back together. And God was pleased to use Jesus to bring us back together with God. So that all those who would recognize that they need rescue, they need forgiveness, who see that Jesus is the only Son of God and the only one that can bring them back, and who cry out, save me, he brings back home. Not because they're good enough, not because they try hard enough, not because they bridge the gap far enough, but because they believe that he will. He reconciles them to himself. But God was not just reconciling us to himself, but all things. Because whenever Adam and Eve were there, all of creation was united under the authority of God. But whenever we came in, creation was rendered asunder. I don't know why I said it that way. Creation was torn apart. And God said, I'm going to let that be for a little while, but there's coming a time when I will unite things back to myself. All of creation, not just those people I lost, but all of creation reconciled back to me, whether on earth or in heaven. And he will make peace between us and God by the blood of the cross. And then we go from the universal, we go to the church, the organizational, the familial, and then he brings it back down to the individual in verse 21. And you, You, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Jesus, the creator and sustainer of all things, who chose to use this organization to change the entire world, he didn't just do that on the organizational level, but he came down to the individual level. And you, who were alienated from God, hostile in mind, means that you didn't even want to be saved. But Jesus, while we were still openly enjoying our sin, gave himself so that we would have the opportunity to be saved. And not all of us will be. But while we were still hostile in mind, this one who created and sustains all things made it possible that we would be reunited. Not even because we were like pretty please, but in the hope that we would. He has brought us back together. You want to know where Jesus ranks? You get the Creator, but you don't get Jesus. You don't know how Jesus fits in here. You don't know who Jesus is in here. Jesus is the one that brings you back to the Father, and he has done that. You want to know where Jesus ranks? He is equal to the Father. He is one with the Father. He is the same as the Father, and it's super confusing, but I have a small brain, so that makes sense that it would be super confusing. But he brings this all together. He is preeminent over all things, and you're not worried about Zeus messing with you. You're not worried about Hera messing with you. You're not worried about these Greek gods that they were worried about messing with you. But you've got stuff that you're dealing with, and you think, you wouldn't say this, but you think there's nothing Jesus can do about this. You think you have to fight your way through this. You think you have to fix yourself on this. And what Paul says is that Jesus died to rescue you and bring you back to himself. He is preeminent over all things. He has chosen you to be the ones that he works through, and he can handle whatever it is that you're dealing with. Whether it's a false god, or whether it's the cancer that you're dealing with, whether it's the relationship that you're struggling with, whatever it is that he is before all things. And you have the ability to receive what's been given to you. Verse 23, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. He says, look, if you have faith, and that is not faith of the moment that says, yes, I really would like to not go to hell, please. Yeah, I acknowledge you're different, but not the faith that says I am completely sold out because I have nothing to offer, that I am broken, that I am hopeless, and I need you. The kind of faith that says if this parachute doesn't work, I die. If you don't have that kind of faith, but you have the faith that says, I would like to cover my bases, please. And Sunday morning is not too much to ask. I'll give you Sunday morning. And, you know, I believe in Jesus as long as it gets me where I need to be, but there are times that Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about, and we got to do our own thing. Paul says when you recognize who he is and who you are, then what he does is reconcile you to the Father. But if you're just offering him lip service, he is the creator and sustainer of all things, and you will not fool him on a technicality. You cannot get by with lip service to God. And he says, if you will be faithful and steady in your faith, if you trust him, if you have the kind of faith that says, I need you, that faith saves. But if you have the kind of faith that says, I have a problem that needs to be taken care of, and this seems like a good solution, you're shortchanging the creator of the universe, who has deigned to rescue you. And he calls you to more, to genuine faith that lasts, to genuine surrender to him, to genuine repentance. And if you've done that, then what are you worried about? What are you struggling with? Why is this an issue? Because is there anything that he is not over and above and before? Paul wants you to know that you were made by him. You are sustained by him. He holds you together. And if you want to know who has power over you, it's not your boss. It's not your mom. It's not the President of the United States. It is the one that made you and loves you. He wants you to know that you were made by him. He wants you to know that he rescued you himself. That you were not something to be outsourced. Right? You realize that Jesus, like we don't think about it this way, but you realize like Jesus has all these angels, and they could have been like, yeah, we're going to take care of it this way. Like, it's important. We got to do it, but we should really send like a SVP to take care of this. We don't need the emperor God of the universe to handle this. Like, that's kind of below his pay grade. So we're going to delegate this to someone else. He did not do that. But he rescued you himself. He wants you to know that there is no problem that Jesus doesn't have authority over. Whatever you're struggling with, he has authority over it. He was before it. He will be after it. It only exists because he allows it to exist. You say, but I don't want him to allow it to exist. Well, you're not in charge, so sorry. But he loves you and he made you, and if he's allowing you to endure this without taking it away, it's because he wants to walk with you through this. Finally, guys, he is the head of this church and every church and all the body of believers. He is the head. And he has chosen to work through this organization. He has chosen to work through this family. He said, you know what? I've created everything. I've created galaxies. I've done all of that. But the creation that I'm going to call myself the head of. You realize that? He created all these things. And he created the church. And he said, the one creation I'm going to call myself the direct head of, the supervising manager of, is this one. This one. This is what he has chosen to change the world. This is what he has chosen to use to reconcile all people to himself. And that means that this is not a room where we sit for an hour a week looking in the same direction. We talk a lot about how Jesus assigns people to the body, that he has brought together the members that he wants in each individual church for a purpose. He is the head of that, and he has chosen you to be a part of whatever church he's put you in, whether that's here or somewhere else. And when you say, you know what, I've got more important things to do than serve my function in this body, you're not disobeying me. Who cares if you disobey me? The only ones that have to obey me are my kids. None of you do. It doesn't matter if you disobey me. I am not the head of this thing. He is. And this matters. Not just Sunday morning. Sunday morning is just one thing that we do here. But our function to go out in the world and share the gospel is our job. And he has commanded you to be a part of that. And when you don't do that, you're not disobeying me. You're disobeying him. He has told you that you have a special function in this church as an encourager, as a leader, as a giver, as a servant, as a teacher, as an organizer, whatever it is. He has told you that's your job. And when you say, you know what, that's too much commitment. I got other things I would rather do. I show up on Sunday mornings and I give my tithe. That's all you need from me. You're not disobeying me. You're disobeying him. He is the head of this thing, and this thing matters because he has made it to matter. We can accomplish the mission of Jesus to help reconcile people to him in this community. But it comes when we decide that we're going to obey him, that He, the creator of the universe, who has deigned to lead us, knows what He's talking about. And I'm trying my best to obey Jesus. I'm trying my best to follow His leadership, and I have fallen short and will always follow short. You just got to get ready for that. I fall short all the time. Did it this morning. It's cool. I'm going to do that, but it's not about me. He is the head of this church. And your job is the same as my job. Not to preach, but to fulfill whatever role He gives you here until He moves you somewhere else. Because when He got done spinning Jupiter on His finger and He got done establishing the law of gravity, He said, the thing I'm going to spend the rest of my time on is the church. And I'm not going to give you exact instructions on what that looks like for you because it's different for each of us. But what I know is the Spirit of God is leading you to do something. The Spirit of God has given you a role here. And if you're not fulfilling that, it's a thumb in the nose, it's a thumb of the nose at the one who made you, who sustained you, who would not outsource your rescue, but rescued you Himself, who adopted you and brought you into the family that He might share with you. It's a thumb in His nose, not mine. And so I believe today that He's calling you to do something. Maybe He's calling you to admit that you just kind of half-heartedly do this thing. He wants all-in, sold-out faith from you. Maybe it's for you to admit that you've been trying to do this thing on your own, or you've been trying to get it together and you have not trusted in Him to be the one to save you. Maybe it's that He's calling you to step up and make a commitment to this church or your church. If you're a guest with us here today, you're calling you to step up and make a commitment that you've been refusing to make. Maybe you've made that commitment, but you're not fulfilling that commitment. Whatever it is that He's saying to you today, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Not as the guy in charge, not as the head of this church, because I'm not, but as a fellow believer who's just trying to do whatever Jesus lays out in front of him to do. It's best for you to obey Him because He loves you, but He doesn't want evil for you. He wants good for you. And I'm not here because I need a job, but because He's called me to do something that I didn't really want to do in the first place. And a lot of days don't want to do. But I know that He has called me to this, and I do this, and it changes me because I obey. It makes me different because I obey. My life is better because I obey. Even though if it was my choice, probably not what I would choose. But because I've recognized that He is the creator and sustainer and that He loves me, and I choose to do what He wants for me, my life, my family, my soul are better. And I know you're holding on to things that you don't want to let go of in order to obey Him. But as one who has let go, I'm telling you to jump in. Let it go. Because if He loves you enough to do all this, think about how much more He wants to do. I'm going to stop talking now. Would you stand up? Our Heavenly Father, Lord, everything up until this point and really kind of through this point has kind of been a mess today, Lord. We've had problems left and right. All the things that we try to do to make things better and make things easier for our services seem to have rebelled against us today. But I think it's probably good. We try to exert control over our circumstances and try to exert control over situations and think that we can improve on what You're doing, Lord, but we can't. And so I ask today that Your Spirit would use the words that were spoken, will clean up the mistakes that I made, and that You will speak to us individually. that you will help us to understand who you are and what you've done, and that you are not done, but want us to continue. I ask if there's anyone here today, Lord, that does not know you as Savior, that they have questions about their faith, that they would come and deal with that now. If there's one that you're leading to make a decision and they're refusing to make that decision for whatever reason, Lord, I ask that you would break down those walls now. And Lord, I ask that you would change our view of our church. That we wouldn't see it as a place that we go to get our kids taught, that we wouldn't see it as a place that we go to make friends, that we wouldn't see it as a place that we go to hear a sermon and sing songs, but that we would come to see it as the family that you've given, the family that you've chosen to be the head of in order to change the world. And that we would treat this body accordingly. I ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.